Hello and welcome to BBC Knowledge and a programme on the controversial issue of Britain's slave trading past and whether this country should now not only apologise for that evil but also pay reparations to the descendants of the people it enslaved. I've come to Bristol's historical waterfront because it was from these docks that ships sailed, bringing back with them more than 500,000 Africans into slavery and making 18th century Bristol into one of the country's richest cities. This modern bridge I'm walking along is testament to that history. It's dedicated to the memory of Pero, an African slave who lived and perished in Bristol 200 years ago, and it's part of the city's attempts to come to terms with its past. The bridge also leads to the Arnolfini Arts Centre, where we've put together a specialist panel who'll debate in front of a selected audience the issue of reparations and the costs of slavery. Welcome to the Arnolfini Arts Centre and also welcome to our audience today, some of whom will be contributing to the debate later in the programme by putting questions and points to our panel. But before we introduce our line-up, let's look at the history of Britain's slave trade and the background to the reparations debate.
We are mighty Jacob's ladder. We are
These African Americans are part of a campaign that's demanding the American government keep a promise it made 150 years ago.
At the end of the Civil War, slaves were supposed to have received 40 acres and a mule so that slaves could actually earn their own living after centuries of exploitation. That promise was never kept, and that resentment has long been felt. And so it's a real living issue for African Americans and for all Americans today.
The case for reparations is one of repair. Simply said, it is a repairing of people for the injustices, for the injuries done to them over an extended period of time.
There was an emotional cost, there was a financial cost, there was a psychological cost that people of color in this nation are still paying the price for.
The campaign for reparations is a huge issue in the United States. It's been discussed in Congress and at this year's UN conference on racism. But at that conference, it was the British government that led the debate against reparations. Britain made more money from slavery than virtually any other nation.
The British were the largest shippers of Africans into the Americas. In the 18th century, something like 3 million Africans travelled across the Atlantic in British ships. And the benefits to Britain of not merely what was called the triangular trade, but of slavery in the Americas was equally enormous. The produce that went in British ships, the insurance that underpinned it, the banking that profited from it. All of this actually brought extraordinary material well-being and profitability to the British.
But the question is, who should pay reparations, and is it really feasible to compensate for events that took place centuries ago?
The complexities, the difficulties of organising reparations are just mind-bending. I mean, where do you start, where do you end? Who are you going to compensate? Are you going to compensate the descendants of Africans shipped into the Americas? That is, the whole of the black population of the Americas, which is now in the hundreds of millions.
My ancestors had slaves. I can't apologize for those people, and what they were doing was legal when they did it. As a descendant of a slave owner, I don't think that I should pay. I didn't have anything to do with it.
Perhaps the strongest argument put forward in favour of reparations is that compensation has already been paid to victims of the Holocaust, and the history of slavery itself contains a remarkable precedent.
In the debate about reparations that's emerged in the last few years, people have forgotten that there was another episode of reparations. And it took place in the 1830s when it was decided by the Treasury that £20 million should be set aside for compensation. But it was compensation that was paid not to the slaves, not to the Africans, not to the African Americans, but it was paid to the planters, to the slave owners. British Parliament bought the freedom of 750,000 slaves.
Well, to discuss the issues raised in that film, I'm joined by Dorothy Benton Lewis, who attended September's UN Anti-Racism Conference in South Africa, where the reparations debate was high on the agenda. She's co-founder of NCOBRA, one of the organisations campaigning for reparations to be paid to 20 million descendants of slaves who make up the African-American community. Also with us is Dr. Quayson, Director of Cambridge University's African Studies Centre here. Geraldine van Beuren is a human rights lawyer at the University of London and is currently investigating the issue of slavery and the law. Darcus Howe is a broadcaster and writer and a key commentator on Britain's black communities. And Diane Abbott is Labour MP for Hackney in East London, one of the country's poorest boroughs, and she was Britain's first black female MP. Dorothy Benton Lewis, we heard one man in that film talk about the enormous damage inflicted upon African Americans. He talked of the psychological damage. What did he mean by that?
We still are subjected to the same white supremacist mentality that spawned slavery.
So you think reparations will put all that right?
I think that reparations will give us the opportunity to design a future for ourselves that's different than the prison industrial complex, that's different than the white supremacist educational institutions, that will allow us to have our own economic development institutions. Right now we pay multinational and transnational organizations to come into the African community and hire us essentially at slave wages, give them mega tax breaks, and we're still no better off.
Darcus Howe, do you see a direct link between the conditions of Britain's black communities today and slavery?
Absolutely, but before I say that, I'm minded to tell you that in the middle of the Durban conference, Jack Straw and some presidents from Africa got together and agreed to pay the slave masters that operated in Rhodesia. They put aside £36 million for reparations for farmers in Africa. That's the first thing I find quite remarkable. In regard to ourselves, former slaves from the Caribbean, working on plantations to produce sugar as the Americans produce cotton, I would say if I and millions of us had been left in Africa, we would have developed as the dynamics of Africa would have developed us. We were brought to the Caribbean, described as half man, half beast. Why are you enslaving these people? These are not people. These are half man, half beast. That was the ideological edifice upon which slavery was built. And up to today, that there are huge sections of our community who still are treated as half man, half beast.
So you want reparations in the light of that to Britain's black communities?
Reparations are in order. I think that the question has to be whether you give me £1,000 or whether the money is used to develop an inner city, if the money is used for education. If you go to Brixton now, you would see a huge statue of a man called Lyle, Tate and Lyle, Sugar. The library is named after him. Brockwell Park was built from sugar. The whole slave quarters of blacks is on Water Lane still.
So you're saying this is an affront to Britain's black communities?
We have followed our slave masters here as though we had an instinct for wanting to be repaired.
All right. Geraldine van Beuren, Darcus Howe mentioned the fact that the British government at the anti-racism conference in Durban, South Africa in September was very much against the issue of reparations and didn't want to make an apology because they felt that that would mean that they'd have to pay compensation. Just give us an idea, is there a legal justification for reparations? Because many people say it wasn't illegal at the time, we don't have to pay.
Yes, it's wrongly assumed it wasn't illegal at the time, but if you look at the documents, it was clearly the United States and the United Kingdom acknowledged amongst themselves that slave trading was a form of piracy.
And when you say at the time, when you're talking about?
In 1823, there was an exchange of letters between the two foreign secretaries where they acknowledged slave trading as a form of piracy. And in 1815, even earlier, Castlereagh had wanted to set up the first, or would have been the first international police force to try and prevent slave trading. Now, if it was a form of piracy, then piracy had been illegal almost from time immemorial.
That's the legal argument, is it? That
If
says
it
you
was
can
a breach
pay
of
reparations?
international law, then compensation, damages are payable. I
But
mean, that's
piracy
indisputable.
isn't something which is practiced by states, is it, by that particular legal
Well, it
definition?
was at the time. Licenses were given. And also, if a state closes its eyes and permits piracy, then now, under international human rights law, liability.
So, as a professor of international human rights law, you are saying that the argument that there is no legal justification for reparations today because you can't, after all, compensate people for things which were done centuries ago is just absolute baloney.
I'm saying it hasn't been properly researched. It's wrong.
With Diane Abbott, it sounds like the legal case may be overwhelming, that reparations should be paid to Britain's black communities and in the United States.
I think it's not just a question of legality. I think the moral case for reparations is unanswerable. And the campaign is a worthwhile campaign, even if all it does is make people focus on what slavery was really about. Because a lot of people, a lot of white people, and even a lot of black people, don't really know the reality of slavery, what a brutal system it was, and the massive, mega profits that Britain made from slavery. It was the profits from slavery and sugar which built many of Britain's great ports like Bristol and Liverpool and helped to fund its industrial revolution. When you walk around London and look at Buckingham Palace, as American tourists do, and all the rest of it, people forget that a lot of this wealth, the historic wealth of the British, came out of the profits of slavery. But having said the moral case is unanswerable, and it's very important people understand how much profit was made from slavery and how brutalising it was. There are strategic questions. And if you're saying to me, do I think that every single British black person should get a bag of money, you know, on Monday morning? No, I don't think that's a
So you are against reparations, is what you're saying? You think people should be educated
No,
about
Zeinab,
Britain's
you're not
slavery?
going to pin me up against the wall like that. What I'm saying is that there is an unanswerable moral case, and white people that try and resist the moral case are white people who are not facing up to the reality of racism. And of course the worst thing about slavery was that to justify slavery, the West built up a huge ideological and literary edifice about the inferiority of black people. I also have a problem with any political strategy going forward which pins itself solely on if only white people would do this, if only white people would do that. But don't get me wrong, the moral case for reparations stands.
Dr. Atto Quayson, where do you stand on this legal moral argument?
Sadly, I'm going to be the sole dissenting voice. For the simple reason that even though I think that the evils of slavery have to be acknowledged, and all the wealth that Britain and America and other places that practice slavery gained, all that has to be recognized. I think that the link between that recognition and the request for reparations, I find it difficult to sustain. And the reason why I find it difficult to sustain is that for me, what black people should be aiming for is a juster society for all people, irrespective of color. We can use our experience of injustice as a means to fight for a juster world, anti-racist and everything for all people. The request for reparations to be paid to descendants of slaves will immediately split the alliance.
No, but historically, one of the things about people of African descent is how humane we are. And historically, black people have fought for a juster world for everybody. What the reparations debate says is we need to look at the reality of slavery. We have always fought.
That's not a problem.
We have always fought.
I agree.
Martin Luther King, we have always fought
absolutely
for a juster world for
that
everybody.
we need to examine the legacy of slavery. There's no question. But the link between that and then asking that black people should be recompensed rather than the structural order of injustice should be corrected.
You're saying that Africans shouldn't have recompense, but there is a precedent, or there are a few precedents. Native Americans were given land, Aboriginal people in Australia, Holocaust survivors and the descendants of Holocaust victims, they got money from the German government, the Swiss, the Brits. I mean, why not the Africans?
I think we need to transcend the precedent. What I find objectionable is the idea that anybody, whether, and of course, what this reparations argument really means is that white people should pay money to black people. I find that as a black
But
person...
black people been paying money to Rhodesians last week.
Yes, okay.
Last week,
Wait,
36 million.
That's a
from
separate
this
issue we can
treasury.
do.
All right.
So what I'm saying is that we should find a way of struggling hard for a justice system for all, black people
All right,
as well.
let's see what
Eliminate-
Dorothy Benton Lewis is going to say.
The way you repair a wrong of having stolen land is to give it back. The way you repair a wrong of having stolen lifetimes of labor is to make recompense for it.
Correct.
We have
the system of injustice.
what can be done in the spiritual arena is done by God or somebody, but material wealth has to be done materially.
Are you telling me that you want better education only for blacks?
And
You want
no,
better housing
absolutely
only
not.
for blacks?
Absolutely not, because
Of course, that's not what you're saying.
reparations includes education. The whole edifice has to be unraveled. That just because Africans receive reparations doesn't mean that we're not talking about white people. You know, you pay me reparations. We're talking about the U.S. government in the U.S. The U.S.
And
government pays billions of dollars.
that we're dealing with.
The U.S. government rebuilt Europe. The U.S. government has supported Israel for the past 40 or 50 years. The U.S. government has never made reparations to the Africans or to the extent it should to the Native Americans.
Let's just unpack this a bit. Are you for reparations for African Americans only, or are you talking about reparations which we'll come to later on for Africans too? You're talking very much specifically about the African American.
I am an African born and kidnapped in America.
Right. Okay.
So I'm saying that not only do I need reparations for the labor that I was entitled to as an inheritance from my foreparents and the continuing impact, but I also lost land in Africa. Millions of Africans were taken from Africa. We were land people.
Okay. Diane
Can I
Abbott.
just say, I said right at the beginning, I don't want to speak to the African-American situation. I said right at the beginning, I don't believe necessarily that giving each and every black British person a bag of money on Monday morning is the answer, but I'm astonished that anybody would query the moral basis for reparations, and I still don't understand. If you can give... No, let me finish now. No, let me finish. If you can give... No, I mean, this thing about giving people, individuals money, I have a problem with it in a British context, okay? And I have a problem if the only focus of our campaign is saying if only white people would do X, Y, or Z. But I'm astonished that anybody would query the moral basis for reparations. And if reparations is good for the Japanese, and if it's good for the Germans, why is it so terrible?
He has no problems with the moral case or the recognition.
He has no problems because the other thing I found problematic...
translation from the moral
to the financial.
No, the other thing I found problematic when you said that black people should be struggling for a better world for everybody.
Absolutely.
People of African descent are the most humane people on the planet. Black people fought in the First World War black people, Caribbean people fought in the Second World War against Nazism. We have always struggled for a better world for everybody. What we want acknowledged is the terrible brutality and the massive profits which the West made from slavery.
Do you do that? Let's just move to the practicalities.
You know, the practicalities are quite simple, Beuren, with the Caribbean. I am from the Caribbean. I'm a descendant of a slave. Before they came to Africa, they weren't nothing like me in the Caribbean. And we weren't paid wages, we were brutalized, we were demonized, and we want reparations for that.
But is that financial reparations you're saying? And, all right, let's ask you, Darcus, you want it.
You know what I need?
How will it be done? How will it be done?
Okay,
just
let me
explain to us.
explain how it will
You've
be
given
done.
the principles, you've made the moral arguments.
Okay.
Let me ask you briefly, how do you do it here?
Capital to who exactly benefited, way and above what they deserve.
So let's just put an example.
Sugar.
All right, let's take Bristol. A lot of the riches of Bristol came from its slave trading past. You find now the great-great-great-great-grandchildren of a slave trader. They're perhaps living in poverty themselves. What happens? Are you suggesting that they should pay the descendants of slaves now?
I am talking about Tate and Lyle. I'm talking about banks.
So companies, banks, governments?
I'm talking about capitalists.
What about taxpayers, government?
I don't want to pay tax for reparations for land in Jamaica when they got Tate and Lyle.
So it's just
those big bags you see in the supermarket, my friend.
Darcus Howe, so you're saying
it's not about
compensation
with the sugar
from
in it, my friend.
They
made millions.
Darcus Howe, you're saying compensation from companies. A lot of
compensation in the form of capital,
not
a dignified dole.
Not governments. You're not saying that the British taxpayer
The
should
British
pay...
taxpayer is in charge of what capital does in this country.
No, but are you saying
they
that
could pass a law saying, you, Tate and Lyle, over a period of time, you will pay to the Caribbean Export.
But it's not taking the British
Or else it would be
taxpayers'
seen.
Very
money.
interesting.
Do you think it should come from government?
I find it very
taxpayer?
interesting that we only are concerned about the taxpayer when we talk about African reparations. Reparations have been paid to millions of different groups. Not millions, okay.
A few. We've
a
named
few.
the precedents a while ago.
But it's about the government who created the climate of acceptance and made it appropriate, made it illegal in the USA. Everybody was called into the service of capturing an African who simply wanted to be free.
But how do you, so you've given us
The U.S. government.
How do you do it?
The U.S. government pays it however we decide, we as a people.
But you must have thought about
democratically.
it. You've been
Yes.
in this debate
We
for a
want
long
land,
time.
we want education.
Where does that
we want
land come from? Do
healthcare.
you take it from people who already own it, perhaps?
The U.S. government owns a lot of land in the USA.
right. So it comes
They
from
have
the state.
stolen it fair and square. You know, they've eliminated millions of people, races.
Right. You get the land,
yeah, we get
state-owned land,
Yeah, some Africans want to go back to Africa.
Repatriate some people?
Yes, and they want the resources to do it. Our tax dollars airlifted Russians to Israel. We had nothing to do with anti-Semitism
Geraldine,
in Israel.
just give us an idea then of the kind of legal difficulties that might surround this for any government. I mean, what do you do then? Do you say white taxpayers pay, not black taxpayers in the United States, to help repatriate these people or to set up or whatever? I mean, how would it actually work? The practicalities will be difficult.
Well, I don't want to stop any individual group taking an action in their own country, but I think really it has to be looked at internationally, because what we were looking at is a trade, an economic trade globally. And so I think what we really need is a proper discussion, an international commission set up to investigate these, not as a delaying mechanism, it's one of the things that are needed, to investigate, who should be paying, who should receive, what level of quantum. Now, these are complex issues, but they are quite possible to reach a solution.
Very important. But as a person of African descent living in Britain, I would rather see the issue of reparations for black people in Britain, certainly seen in a much more international...
Would you be worried that it would be divisive if it was seen in a British context, that the African, Caribbean communities here say, we want reparations and we want to say... Are you worried that there might be, in a sense, a kind of backlash from white taxpayers saying, well, why should the sins of my forefathers, foremothers be visited on me?
I think you're oversimplifying.
Because the benefits have been visited upon them.
Fine, that's your answer to them.
If the benefits have been visited upon you, so shall the sins be visited upon you.
We have a number of
You
white
see,
people.
it's not... You can find quite a number of white people who would say yes. So this thing about making divisions before they happen, for me, are quite wrong.
Right.
We were set back in our human development centuries by this intervention. Nobody can deny that. And it is now a political problem.
But do the passive recipients of the benefits of slavery, which a large number of white Britons might say they are, should they really be forced
I don't mind
to
being
deep
the
in their
passive
pockets?
recipient of £1 million this minute. Whether it's passive or active is not the case.
Let me bring Dr. Atto Quayson here first, because a lot of people have said in the United States that this issue of reparations kind of distracts from the main goal. And the main goal is to try to address the fact that a large number of black Americans form a disproportionate number of the country's poor and deprived, as you've very eloquently outlined, and that if you pay reparations, a lot of white conservatives might actually turn around and say, fine, we've paid them the money, we're not going to do our positive, our affirmative action programs, we're not going to bother about having urban regeneration schemes. Is there a danger, do you think, that if this reparations issue is accepted, that might happen?
I suspect there is a danger there very strongly, but beyond that, there's even a bigger danger. And the bigger danger is that once, if that were, it was possible to address African-American issues in terms of reparation, it would, I think, damage the African-Americans' capacity to form alliances with other. No, let me finish. That's my view.
Alliances between
alliances. No, alliances with all progressives of whatever race.
But
alliances with all progressives. We should continue. That's what I'm saying. Because that will ghettoize. There's another reason why I find objectionable.
We have a multiracial organization of people from every race and nationality and ethnic group. I came from one. that was built on that. People like justice. People say it's the decent thing to do. It is the only way we can redeem America.
But you also
Once we
have
get rid
said-
of white supremacy and
You also
racism,
have said
people are willing to do the right thing.
The way you define reparations, as far as I gather, is that you want a better education for blacks, better education, better housing, the
we want to be in
revitalization
control
of... Now, what
of the
I'm saying is that
Better housing,
all
they
those
don't live
arguments
anywhere.
are good. Those arguments are good, but it should not be advanced only for blacks.
No, the point about saying that black Americans want better education and better housing is that if you take the totality of black Americans, their housing and education is so much worse than white people. So what they're saying is they want as good as white people. So I don't know why you keep bringing... They should be speaking for white.
Why do they need to talk about it in terms of
Because if
reparations?
they don't talk about
our
their
education is bad. We want better
That
education.
African people have fought for in the USA, everybody has benefited. Everybody has benefited. When you fight for justice, everybody benefits. So to say that reparations only benefits African Americans is to miss the point.
Right.
But we don't have to make the point.
You're saying that you want
Geraldine,
better housing
Can I
for
ask
African
Geraldine
Americans,
Van
which is
Beuren
a
wants to
good
come
thing.
in.
Of course, African Americans need better housing, better education.
So you think
all that.
reparations is a bit of a distraction?
That's what I'm saying.
Concentrate on that.
No,
Okay.
that's
The
charity.
reparations
That's
argument is a
charity.
complete
Okay,
distraction.
let's say Geraldine
That
Van
is don't
Beuren,
fight
you
at
wanted
all.
to come in on a
What I
point.
don't understand is why you don't see reparations as part of the transformatory process. Why you don't see it as giving justice to all.
Okay, let me say this. Let me perhaps clarify myself.
Please.
I am not saying that slavery, the evils of slavery must not be recognized. I'm not saying that all the monies and the extraction of labor and the toil of black people must not be acknowledged. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that that is one stage. The translation of that recognition into the argument that because of that suffering, black people as an entity should have monies from whether states or companies or white people, that it is that leap.
that is-
that
Would
I
you
find-
want an? Let me just ask you. Would you
Even
want an
education
apology?
I
Would
want
you
an
want an
apology.
apology?
I want an
What
apology.
for?
Why
Why
not?
not? Let me tell you why I would want an apology. I would want an apology because I want all human beings to be affronted by injustice. That is why I want
All
to,
right.
not because of money,
Let's have Dorothy Benton say.
but affronted by injustice. So everyone becomes affronted by injustice.
An apology from an unapologetic, unremorseful, unrepenting
But they would be
entity.
if they apologised.
No,
They
they
would
would
be
just, it would just be a performer.
So an
It's-
apology
it's-
without compensation
It's
would not
empty.
be
It's
because
empty.
that's what the
You
president
cannot
of
get
Nigeria
health care.
suggested.
You cannot get health care with an apology. You cannot have a housing with an apology. You cannot get land with an apology. The issue is material. Spiritual
Roman
issues
Catholic
we take
talk.
care in the spiritual arena. Material
Christian
issues.
talk.
But you know, the U.S. government brought together dozens of people from the international community and muzzled them on the issue of reparations. The citadel of free speech muzzled the international community on the issue of reparations, said you should not talk about this. It has muzzled the African group for many years on talking about reparations because we won't give you any support if you talk about reparations. It is colonialism. It is bogus.
Have you had much support from the African? Do you think that the Africans in Africa itself, I mean, I know we have one example here, are not giving enough support to the African Americans in this?
I think that we won a victory in Durban. I think we got some support from African
It
people.
was a huge advance, Durban.
Absolutely.
You laid the foundations, you think? For
Yes, absolutely. And we tell people that this is not a domestic issue. When you have people from one continent kidnapping a people from a second continent, enslaving them on a third continent belonging to neither, and committing genocide on all those people, that is an international issue of catastrophic.
Just want to ask Geraldine Van Beuren. Again, I mean, suppose this reparations debate did actually come to fruition for Africans in Britain, Caribbean people in Britain, African Americans. Would it then really open the road for a lot of Asian people here in Britain may have grievances against the activities of the British when they had their empire and so on? Do you think we might start seeing claims from Sikhs and other Indian communities, for instance?
Well, that's what the British government is very scared of because, of course, slavery and colonialism are intermingled. And they're very worried that if they admit and pay reparations for slavery, then they're going to have to start paying reparations for colonialism. And it will be expensive. Reparations is also important as building a sense of community, realizing what we have done to each other. And that educative process, rather like the South African Truth and Reconciliation process, is also important. And the risk, if we don't pay reparations or we don't actually consider it properly, is that we'll suffer from social amnesia. And we'll continue. And we'll continue. We have trafficking growing, slavery is growing, child trafficking is growing at the moment.
You know, it's quite simple. We borrow a lot of money which we can't pay back, governments. We get a handful of grants which are directed specifically by those who give it to us to be spent here, there, and everywhere. There is no single way that we can develop and proceed by borrowing money from the World Bank. That's done.
All right, you're talking
what
about
we're
debt
saying
here,
now,
right.
therefore, we have a right to some of that money.
All right,
and I think that's a beautiful leap in consciousness, and we should pursue it as we did 100 years ago. We raise it again now.
All right, Darcus, well, Geraldine van Beuren, you did mention about the link between slavery and colonialism, and indeed so far in this debate we've been mainly discussing how slavery and reparations have affected people who are the descendants of slaves in Britain, the Caribbean and the United States. But there's another issue, of course, and that's the impact that slavery has had upon Africa and Africans. But before we go on to discuss that, here's the second of our short films examining the case for reparations as put forward by African nations. Every one of the millions of Africans stolen away from the continent represented not only a personal human tragedy, but a calamity for Africa itself. And what concerns many of today's Africans is the damage done to the continent by the slave trade through the huge depopulation and destabilization it caused.
I think we have to think of two things in particular when we talk about the impact of the slave trade on Africa. One is we don't know how many millions of people were lost to the continent, but we do know that the youngest, the fittest, if you want to say the best and the brightest, were siphoned out of the country and lost to the continent. And there's a whole demoralization that goes with the slave trade, the influx of liquor, of armaments into the continent, the fomenting of wars to facilitate the trade in slaves. That couldn't have been a good thing for the continent.
But many say Africa's claims are undermined by the fact that Africans themselves were involved in the slave trade.
All of the Africans, the very great bulk of them anyway, that were bought by the Europeans on the West African coast were bought from other Africans. All of the Africans that we know of that were shipped onto the slave ships had travelled upwards of 6 months before they touched the Atlantic coast, before they saw white people for the first time. And they travelled because they'd been bought, traded, bartered by other Africans deep into the interior of Africa. Now, how do you build that into the formula of who you're going to compensate and why? It simply isn't an issue that divides between black and white, between Europe and Africa, between white Americans and black Americans. Here's an issue that's fraught with historical complexities.
The other great problem facing African demands for compensation is how to ensure the money reaches the ordinary people. But for many, reparations represents a way to end the legacy of slavery and transform Africa's place in the world.
Hopefully, the argument is that reparations will usher in a new sense of fairness on the world stage, and a new sense of justice on the international stage. So I think that's the real hope, that there is going to be a sort of change in perception.
Dr. Atto Quayson, Africans have long complained about the evils of colonialism, but isn't that essentially a slavery legacy? The two can be used interchangeably?
Yes, that's definitely true. Because in a way the populations were decimated and they were in a way softened for colonialism. And quite apart from that, the injection of new arms and ammunition, they led to escalation in wars between the tribes and all that. And in fact, it was the wars which were triggered by slavery, because there were slave rates and all that. That became one of the excuses that the colonialists used. So they were coming to settle these warring tribes and then introduce. So
why are the African governments then not saying that they support reparations for slavery if they admit that they are the victims of colonialism stroke slavery?
Okay, the thing is that the issue is much more complex than just that. Already it was mentioned in the film that Africans themselves have to acknowledge a degree of complicity because the African ethnic groups participated in slave raiding and all that. So that the reparation, if both apology and reparations have to be considered, Africans have to acknowledge their complicity in it.
Dorothy, Benton Lewis, let me ask you, isn't that the difficulty with the reparations argument? It's very complicated. It sounds like black Africans are going to have to dig in their pockets for the reparations.
That's a bogus argument. It's like saying, white people participated in the Holocaust, and therefore the Jewish people should not be compensated. It's, victims are victims, and governments need to be held accountable. Of course, Africa has a price to pay. Some of the Africans want to come back. So African countries are acknowledging that they're making land available, they're offering dual citizenship, and they're inviting African people. So much of the divide and conquer has been that Africans in the U.S. and the Caribbean have thought that Africans on the continent do not like them. We have been told that Africans on the continent do not like us, and Africans on the continent have been told that we don't like them. It's the proverbial divide and conquer. The same thing happened in the U.S. with the Native American population. Land was stolen. White people were given 100 acres and a mule just for showing up and being white.
All right, Diane Abbott's not spoken yet. If you
can I just deal with this complicity argument? Because Dorothy's right, it's a bogus one. Let's just deal with it once and for all. Yes, of course, some Africans were complicit in the slave trade. There were Jewish people in the gas chambers who wore armbands and played a minor role. They were capos until they themselves were killed. That doesn't mean to say that the responsibility for concentration camps and Nazism doesn't rest fair and square with the Nazis. But the more important point, in a way, is this, that yes, some Africans were complicit, but it wasn't Africans who made the mega profits out of slavery. It wasn't Africans that erected a whole ideological edifice which said that slaves were only half human. So I don't think you can compare the complicity of individual African traders with the fact that the West was able to fund its whole industrial supremacy from the profits of slavery and sugar and the middle traffic.
Geraldine Van Beuren, I mean, is what Diane Abbott says accurate? I mean, she uses the analogy of some Jews who wore the armbands in the Holocaust. I mean, does that have any real basis to it, do you think, that argument?
Well, yes, I think it does. I mean, it's a question of scale, and people are using African participation as an argument against reparations, as an argument against liability, both morally and legally, and I think it's a point that has to be made, yes.
But I mean,
what we have to know that is very important, my friends. In slavery in the Caribbean, they tried the local Indian population, they tried the Chinese, they tried the Portuguese, and none of them could not make the level of skill of agriculture that was required. It means that Africa had reached a certain level of development in producing food and in producing masses and masses of acreage of some product. The Africans came highly developed.
All right, but let
me finish.
Yeah.
And it meant a destruction, therefore, in African agriculture.
But do you agree?
Let me finish. It meant a destruction, not only taking people, destroying a high level of productivity that was there. Therein lies the basis of my complicity.
Quayson, I just want to go back to the complicity argument, because both Diane Abbott and Geraldine Van Beuren have brought up the Jewish analogy. I think many people would actually argue with that.
Yeah. I want to
it's a question,
correct. I want to correct
argument
something.
It's a question of scale.
I want to correct something because Diane mentioned that the African complicity was limited to individual traders. That's actually not true. There were entire tribes. This is a big embarrassment to Africans. I'm not saying that Africans acknowledging their complicity exonerates the West. I've not said that if Africans take part of the responsibility, it's an exoneration of the West. You mentioned in passing earlier that African governments are making land available dual citizenship. Let me tell you a fact. Especially the dual citizenship business is purely an economic instrument. No African government, take it from me, will accept, let us say, the many African Americans who African Americans who come out of jail. They want rich African Americans. So it's an instrument to attract it's an economic instrument. So it's not like these African governments have now in acknowledging that they sold their brethren outside, are now opening their doors.
All right.
The dual citizenship, giving land, they're only going to allow rich African Americans to come.
We've dealt with that. Let me ask Darcus Howe this. Darcus Howe, a lot of African governments are saying, OK, put the issue of slavery to one side, but we have huge problems on our continent, AIDS, poverty, debt. We're shackled by huge debt repayments, you know, so on and so unfair terms of trade. We're not sharing equally in the benefits of globalisation and so on. Give us a kind of Marshall Plan. It's called the New African Initiative. Is that what you want to see, the international economic order giving more money to Africa?
Without that, Africa is finished. Without it, is finished. Because, you see, I could link the destruction of our African agriculture, transferring millions to the Caribbean. They have never recovered from that. What they met Africans doing, Africans are still doing. They have never recovered from that. A plow is the latest instrument that they've had. Over here, I mean, it's a joke. It really is a joke. We cannot recover. It goes further down and down and down and down. And to take reparations with dignity means that the Africans themselves know that they are part of something that they had done 400 years ago and deserve it. We don't want to beg for any money because we believe that this money is here, it ought to be transferred, the whole culture of African peasantry should be lifted. Right. You know something?
That's fair enough.
I want to go a little further than that. I want to go a little further than that. The relationship between the African educated and the African peasantry is so wide, so destructive, that I would start to blame some of the African intelligentsia now for what is taking place in Africa.
Answer that point.
Because
the African
elites, they're feeling a little embarrassed.
Specifically, just Darcus, you put the point, let me answer. The role of the African elites, not exactly covered in glory, then I'll come to you.
African elites have shown themselves, many of them, to have no interest whatsoever in Africa. The first thing. The second point is that Africa, the African state, the post-colonial African state, has been hijacked across the continent by what I would like to term kleptocrats. They are kleptocratic, megalomaniac, madmen, thieves. I mean thieves. Thieves and the opportunity. For example, it is true, you are right. I mean, the slavery really did major damage to our rural economies and all that. But there were opportunities to rectify, to go some way towards rectifying these problems. For example, in Nigeria, what could Nigeria not have done after independence? They blew the money, stole the money, put it in Western banks and all that. So I don't think that it's a simple thing of saying that...
I'll come to you, but I just want to ask Geraldine Van Beuren very quickly. I mean, is there a legal framework that somebody could introduce to say, well, OK, let's just assume that the African governments do get a kind of Marshall Plan given to them to say that the money has got to reach the ordinary people. It mustn't just go into the pockets of the elites.
Yes, I mean, there's case law, there's precedent on that, where reparations damages has been paid to communities to build schools set up in a trust fund. So it can be very carefully controlled.
So it would be done quite easy practically.
Yes.
Diane Abbott.
I just want to say that I think that the moral case for reparations for Africa is unanswerable. And I think the practical case for reparations is unanswerable also. And I think it should take the form, as you say, some sort of Marshall Plan. I mean, the issue of debt forgiveness, Darcus was saying African countries have borrowed money and they can't pay it back. Actually, they've paid it back. What they're doing now is paying the interest on the interest on the interest. The debt thing is a scandal. There's debt forgiveness, there's the terms of trade, there's all sorts, there's a package of measures. Because the problem with Africa is not just that Africa is poor in absolute terms. What has happened in much of Africa, that in terms of education and health, even standards of nutrition, they have fallen back in the past decade. And what is happening with international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank is that they are funneling money to Eastern Europe and Russia at the expense of Africa. Money from international institutions and trade is flowing away from Africa. So Africa is not just poor, Africa will go backwards. It needs reparations and it needs a Marshall Plan package urgently. I think it's as important for black people in Britain that Africa gets justice and Africa gets reparations as anything else.
Let me put this to Dorothy Benton Lewis. Dorothy Benton Lewis, I mean, there is an argument that says that you African Americans concentrating very narrowly on your own reparations case, and the problems, as we've just heard, of the continent of Africa are overwhelming. Millions of people living on the edge of life or death. Why don't you throw your considerable weight, your voices? You have two key African Americans now at the heart of the US government to say Africa must get its Marshall Plan.
Absolutely. We are a coalition of organizations. Some of us believe that reparations should be for Africa. Some that believe that reparations is affirmative action. We've got all those in between. So it's a coalition. And we've been forging that coalition to come up with a plan that works to address all of our diverse interests. And we have an international commission that includes people from all over the world to look at reparations in the different countries. Now, we can't say what reparations should look like in Britain or in Ghana or someplace else. It's for those people in those different countries to take that issue up.
But it's very different. It's very different, isn't it? The descendants of slaves in Britain and America, the United States, is a very different matter from Africans living in the continent of Africa now who are suffering the legacy of colonialism.
Absolutely.
Slightly different arguments. And slavery. And slavery too. But they're slightly different things.
Let me say this, that South Africa, and I discovered that after being there, was founded on slavery. You know, Britain sent people to South Africa and gave them 100 acres of land to go there. It was an enticement so that they could take land from the indigenous people. So Britain has been complicit in land theft in Africa, in the USA, in New Zealand, in all over the world. It's that same kind of theft all over the world.
Let me say this. Now, it is quite clear. I mean, we would be blindfolding ourselves not to admit that Africa is in severe crisis. And I think that it is necessary for a major and elaborate plan of rescuing the continent from its current woes. But I am a bit disquieted, you know, by the argument that Africa should gain assistance because it has been a victim of history. That is to say, because of victimhood.
You know, that's
You're not happy with the sense of victimhood.
The attachment.
Why are you? Just let him explain what he said. Why are you not happy? You think that there's a sense of victimhood being fostered?
Yeah, because
some African elites.
Victimhood.
I deliberately did not talk about any victimhood. I am talking about cash money, billions that were expropriated from Africa, and not just in terms of slavery, but its raw materials taken, and the West got the benefit. Billions that have been...
So it's theirs by right?
Do you know?
You're saying?
Do you know there is a much larger flow of money away from the continent of Africa in terms of repayments of debt? That is a much, much larger flow than anything Africa gets in aid.
Africa is being bled dry now.
I would say...
Quayson, it's not a question of history. Africa is suffering unfair
so the argument,
unfair
exactly. So
economic order now.
The way I, as an African...
This is part of a fight. I ain't no victim.
So why link it to slavery then, Darcus? Why link it to slavery?
What I would want
because I'm saying you destroyed here, give me back my money, or else.
The emphasis, you see, there's a slight change in emphasis when you say, you've stolen my money, so I want it back, from saying that because I was a slave and a victim and all that, I want, you know, that you expropriated the money that is my money. So
that's the European educational system.
No, can I just say
there is no definition of slavery. It's hid under the issue of trade, the inhumanity, the atrociousness, the dehumanization. All of that is hidden under the term slave. People don't seem to understand what slavery means.
The second thing is
so you think it encompasses colonialism and an unfair international economic order that there is now?
The world order is incredibly unjust.
Let me just ask Geraldine Van Beuren to clarify something. You said just a moment ago, as an aside, I fear it was drowned out, that victimhood and entitlement are not the same thing. Just clarify that.
Yes, because entitlement is empowering. I mean, you're perhaps unintentionally attacking the whole of the human rights system. Someone makes a claim for something that was wrongfully done or taken to them. It's an empowering, it's not a weakening victimhood.
Yeah. So there's a distinction between victimhood and entitlement.
Yes.
I like entitlement. I'm entitled to it, not because I'm a victim.
Many people who are victims take that victim status and do some very positive things with it. So to say that there are no victims is ludicrous.
I'm not
Things
saying there are no
happen to
victims.
people, but people can take that and do something with it that liberates mankind, that takes us to another level of humanity, that restores our humanity, that gives it back to us.
We're coming to the end of this debate for the time being now, but Diane, let me finish with you perhaps. Many people have criticised the African middle class, African-American middle class in the United States, African middle class, Caribbean middle class here in Britain, that they don't actually do enough to help the more deprived elements of their society, with the honourable exception of people like you who represents a very poor community. Is there a sense that there is a duty and responsibility on those Africans who are better off, whether they are in the diaspora or in the continent themselves, to try to help their own communities?
I think it is very dangerous to have unnecessary divisions between Africans on the continent and the African diaspora, whether in America or Britain. I think this reparations debate is a crucial debate. It raises very important moral issues. I want to see the response be an international response. And I think we have a responsibility, all of us who are of African descent have a responsibility to each other, because we will all be stronger. If Africans on the continent are strong, Africans in America and people of African descent in Britain will be strong. We will all be stronger if we support each other. And that's why, in principle, I do support my black comrades in America struggling around the reparations issue.
All right, thank you all very much. I'd like now to turn to our specially invited audience who've been listening very patiently and see who'd like to raise some questions or make comments on what they've heard from our panel. Let me start, however, by going to someone whose background really illustrates the difficulties facing the reparations campaign. Dr. Glenn Jordan is a descendant of a slave and a slave owner.
Yes. I suppose if anybody deserves reparations, I do.
He said if anybody deserves reparations, he does. Explain yourself.
On my father's side, Jordan is a slave name. My father's people are descended from a slave master and a slave woman. I don't know if we're descendant of a rape or a relationship. My father worked 34 years carrying steel garbage cans on his back because he couldn't get in unions. Someone wanted to pay reparations to him, I could understand it. But now, I think, if people want to make some contributions to some sort of collective funds, that would do something to eradicate racism. People want to contribute to some collective funds that would help to make the world a better place. I, in fact, would make a contribution.
If people want to contribute, do you mean in charity for
well, I'm saying even
regeneration programs?
I'm saying if states, if multinationals, people, whatever. All I'm saying is that I don't see, it seems a rather an American kind of idea that, that individuals should be given bags of money. That I find a bit disturbing. But I don't find disturbing that we as a people are owed, and that therefore some sort of recompense should be made at a group kind of level.
Right. Who else wants to make a point?
Beuren Bandeli, Malcolm X Community Center. The issue of reparation has to be seen in terms of what the late Ahmed Seketori said. 300 million African people were affected by slavery. I don't think we can talk about money to compensate for that. And therefore, what we should be looking at is all the continued theft that continues of African resources that has made Africa, which is the wealthiest continent, poor, its people the poorest. And so we have formulas we could use as to what the compensation should be. I think that we shouldn't grapple here with how this is paid, because this is the argument that distracts from the real issue. The issue, I think, is that the British government, the American government, and all the major institutions like Barclays Bank, like some of your royal families, who actually had their percentage of slavery or got their titles after they sold up land in the Caribbean to buy their titles. So we know who should be paying. It's a question of us sitting down and saying when it's going to be paid.
Okay, practicality is the problem, not the principle. Gentleman there at the back there, yeah.
Sean Stabler is a work in education here in Bristol. I'd like to make 2 points. The first is that I was very insulted by the British government when they refused to describe the slave trade as a crime against humanity in the recent conference. I thought that sort of, I don't know, made I think made a lot of African Caribbean descendants in this country think about their position in this country, and that was disappointing they took that stance. My second point is that I think Diane and Darcus both eloquently described how Africa has been underdeveloped by the slave trade, and it's for that reason why I think that the reparations should be looked at the continent of Africa and how we can actually develop it and stop it from being underdeveloped. And like Diane said, is the interest they're paying off, it's not the actual debt. So I think that's where the concentration of the effort should be.
Right. British government registered its abhorrence and said it regretted it, just refused to make an apology. That wasn't enough for you?
No.
OK. This young man here.
My name is Will, I'm a student. I have a question to the guests. Don't quite understand why should the present descendants of the slaves should be paid compensations, because personally none of them ever toiled for any slave masters. And if any reparations should be paid, they should be paid for special funds, not to any complete people. And I just want to ask the question, you know, what should you do with the money you're going to be paid?
Okay.
Well, that's why we're having a mass-based grassroots movement, so that people, the masses of people, can decide what kind of reparations we need that's going to liberate us from structural white supremacy, such that we are in control of our economic development, such that we are in control of our education. And we in the USA are very aware of inheritance laws. Land and monies is a very strong component of the U.S. wealth. So we're saying that not only are we entitled to reparations for current wrongs, we are entitled to the wealth that our foreparents created. The slavers are dead, those enslaved are dead, but the wealth is multiplying and being handed down from generation to the next by those who didn't earn it.
We've got to end this debate. I very quickly just want to go around and ask you, do you think that you are going to win the reparations debate and you're actually going to see money released from whatever source and to whomever?
Yeah, absolutely. Not just money, but land and other things.
You think you'll get it?
Absolutely.
Geraldine Van Beuren?
Yes, I think it's going to be a slow process, but I think more and more people are beginning to realise the injustices that were perpetrated.
Diane Abbott?
I think whether you call it reparations or not, the case for economic justice for Africa and people of African descent has to be made and will be won, because actually it's in everybody's interest to have a fair and just society.
Dr. Atto Quayson?
I want social justice for all, irrespective of
But no, do you think
colour.
reparations is going to come about? Financial compensation and land, as Dorothy Benton Lewis said, fair international economic order for Africans in Africa and
fair
the
international
diaspora.
economic order for all people. I hope it comes about.
I think we are better poised now than at any time in our history to make a powerful demand and a successful demand for it. First of all, independence has failed. So we don't have that to deal with anymore. There is something called the internet, there is television, and there are new instruments of communication which put us in a very great position. I want to say something, I want to be very careful how I say it. There is a growing and dangerous anger among the dispossessed over recalling things past and what is present. And Mr. Blair and Mr. Bush and they better not ignore it.
Thank you.
Something about that.
Thank you very much. No, I think we really must leave it there. Just before we end, I just want to do a straw poll here, a little crude, I know, but who in our audience would favour reparations along the lines that Dorothy Benton Lewis was talking about for African Americans and the descendants of slaves in the diaspora, in Britain, elsewhere? Put your hands up if you're in favour of that. I don't know, about 10 hands have gone up. OK, by far the majority don't agree with that. And who thinks that reparations should be made in terms of a kind of African initiative, a Marshall Plan for the continent of Africa? Many more hands have gone up for that. I would say bit more than half are in favour of that. OK, thank you very much. Now, we're going to have to leave that debate there. I'd like to thank our panel, Diane Abbott, Geraldine Van Beuren, Dorothy Benton Lewis, Dr. Atto Quayson, and, of course, Darcus Howe. And thank you all to our audience here in Bristol and, of course, to all of you watching. From me, Zeinab Bedawi, goodbye.